Hello, Shades here. I'm going to be trying something a little different today for this video. A new editing style that I am hoping will be both quicker to produce and have more of a structure, therefore allowing me to get these shorter videos out more frequently. I say shorter, yet anybody who has watched a few of my videos I'm sure has noticed that I tend to waffle rather often. A good example of this would be what I'm doing right now. So, on with the video. I hope that you enjoy. Neanderthals were first discovered in 1848 by some British soldiers working in some caves in Gibraltar. They dug up a skull that had strong human-like characteristics, yet also was somewhat ape-like in form. It had a massive brow ridge above the eyes, a low sloping forehead, and was made out of much thicker bone than a modern human's. In 1848, the world was not yet ready for the concept that there were earlier versions of, or relatives to, humanity. It wasn't until the mid-1850s, when construction workers in Germany were digging through an old clay deposit, that more skeletons were discovered in a rock shelter. The place where these discoveries were made was called the Neander Valley. The German word for valley is Tal, and thus these new forms of early humans were called Neanderthals. Under close examination, the bones revealed striking anatomical similarities between themselves and modern people, Homo sapiens. At first, many theorized that the bones were skeletons of deformed modern humans, or even skeletons of people from other parts of the world. However, as more and more finds were discovered, it became clear that they were looking at a group of early humans that no longer existed in the present world. Thus, what occurred in the early part of the 20th century was nothing short of an archaeological revolution. There is a lovely quote from around this time period. It is from a French archaeologist by the name of Lemercier, and is describing a Neanderthal lying on a bed of flint flakes left over from a stoneworking process called flint knapping. It goes thusly. As if the man were asleep, with his hands tucked under his head, the other hand reaching for the axe, and knees doubled up in a kneeling posture. This is known in the archaeological community as a flexed burial, and most bodies from Neanderthal grave sites are found in this flexed position, basically lying on their sides in the fetal position. Now, Neanderthals would probably not have been aware of what a fetus looked like in the womb. They would certainly, however, have been aware of how babies lay down with their knees pulled high towards the chest. They may have felt that this position was appropriate symbolically, as fitting a body going back into the womb of the earth, and the returning to the earth from which we all have come. Before we get on to the meat of this video, symbolism, ritual, and the possibility of Neanderthal religion, let me first give you a quick overview of what Neanderthals looked like and compare their physical appearance to that of modern humans. Neanderthals would have been shorter than we are, stockier, and much more robust, yet their brains were of a similar size, if not slightly bigger. The Neanderthal brain was arranged, however, very differently to our own. The crania were low. At the back of the skull there was a feature called the occipital bun. We don't really know what the brain in there was doing. There was the same quantity of brain, but if arranged in a different way, what does that mean of its capabilities? Did it have a different set of abilities? Did it have more of what we don't have? Did it have a lack of what we do have? Let's take the cerebral cortex, the area of the brain responsible for the high dome of our own skulls. This section of the brain is thought to act as our analytical computer. Is it therefore probable that the Neanderthal brain didn't have the analytical power that we modern humans have? Could they adapt and problem solve to the same capacity that we can? To be honest, the answer to that question is our old favourite: we just don't know. On the flip side, we Homo sapiens do not possess the occipital bun towards the rear of our brains, so it is also quite probable that Neanderthals possessed skills and abilities that are now lost to us. One thing that is bone-crushingly obvious is that physically they were far stronger and tougher than we were, their bones having much more mass. However, once again, one thing we cannot know is just how their brains allowed them to coordinate their large bones and muscles. We might not know how they worked, but work they did, and if we were to take a Neanderthal, stick him in a tracksuit, and enter him, or her, into the Olympic Games, in events involving running at high speeds over rough or uneven terrain, or feats of strength and endurance, I have no doubt that they would sweep the board. These physical superiorities were not, however, always recognised. For many years, and unfortunately in some cases to this very day, a stereotypical view of the shambling, dull-witted and animalistic caveman Neanderthal has persisted. Let me explain where this false stereotype came from, as it is very implausible for this kind of Neanderthal to be capable of the cultural and social skills necessary for ritual and the possibility of religion. It began around the time of World War I and was formed by this French, typical bloody Frenches, this French scholar called Marcellin Boulet, probably pronounced that wrong. He took a pretty complete skeleton of a male Neanderthal from a rock shelter in the Dodoul Valley in France. Firstly, he took the bones and arranged them back together. Secondly, he added to this skeleton some mocked up flesh. Thirdly, he added the skin. And finally, some rather fashionable animal skins. He observed that there was a crippling deformation of the ankle bones and the bones in the feet in his specimen. He therefore came to the conclusion that this meant that all Neanderthals had walked on the outside of their feet, much like certain modern apes and monkeys do. This created in the public consciousness the image of a gait, where the majority of the body weight is on the outside of the feet, creating a shambling and awkward walk. He also came to the conclusion that the knees were predominantly bent, the arms hung loose at the front, the head tilted forwards, and that they probably would not have been able to speak. He actually stressed that his observations told him that this skeleton emphasised everything most beast-like, most ape-like about Neanderthals. Now, unfortunately, this false image has been very successful in imprinting itself on the imaginations of the public, and it can still be seen in many museums throughout the world. With its vacant expression, this stereotype became so dominant that all the other contemporary evidence was either ignored or vaguely explained away. It's now becoming more and more clear that Neanderthals were actually quite capable of having a strong ritual sense of their own. Many decades passed, with poor Mr. Neanderthal not being given the respect he deserved. Then, one day, a husband and wife team with the surname Selecki decided to tackle the issue. Ralph and his wife Rose were working at Columbia University in New York City in the 1950s. They put together a rather unique for the time team of scholars from many different fields of study. Along with archaeologists, there were biologists, geologists, a palynologist who studied particles in the soil, such as pollen, and many more disciplines. In this way, Ralph Selecki was a bit of a pioneer, bringing all these different disciplines under one roof. The palynologist was of particular importance, being able to tell under the microscope what plants at the time were in the landscape and therefore recreate the environment. The team were aware that in the Near East, on the shore of the Tigris River, artifacts commonly associated with Neanderthals had washed up. This meant it was probable that the Neanderthals had been living in the caves and the hills above, and it was a promising place to start excavations. This proved to be a very successful area, and it was named Shannon Cave, the largest cave in the area and an extremely important one in the study of Neanderthals. It is also the place where we will be finding our evidence for them having a ritualistic and possibly religious way of life, particularly in the relation to death. So let me describe Shannon Cave for you. Shannon Cave is huge, almost cathedral-like. During the excavations, it was actually home to several different Kurdish families. The opening is triangular in shape and around 6 foot high, its apex coming to a Gothic-style archway. The base of this opening is 80 feet broad. As you enter into the main cave, it then doubles in both height and breadth. This incredible cave was often used by Kurdish families, at first hiding from the Ottoman oppression and then from the dictatorship in Baghdad. So it's quite possible that this cave has been in use for tens of thousands of years. In the time that they excavated there, the remains of literally thousands of tools were discovered, along with a huge amount of skeletons. What's important for us is that 9 individual burials were found. Some of these have been caused by accidents, a common one being a rock fall through the cave roof. This is due to Shannon lying right on a geological fault that can clearly be viewed from the front of the cave. So, let's look at one of our first individuals, a male that was found early on in Ralph's excavations and that he named Shannon 1, but why don't we call him Brian? Much like detectives, through analysis of the clues, Ralph and his team were able to theorise a very interesting scenario. So this is the story of the passing of Brian. At the time of his death, Brian was 40 years old, a pretty decent age, meaning that the lives of these people were not always nasty, brutish and short, as many people believe. He had been standing in the cave when he was hit by one of those rock falls and sadly died. Now, his family, or possibly friends, who had come back shortly after, had created a little cairn, which is an arrangement of stones placed over the body. By the way, this is where we get the name of the dog breed, Cairn Terrier, which was the bred to be sent inside these cairns to look for rats and other small creatures as small game. Anyway, the cairn was arranged over poor Brian's crushed body. Soon after, these family and friends came back to the site and they built a fire right on top of the cairn. Once the fire was burning, they proceeded to have a meal. This could quite possibly be one of the earliest examples of a funeral feast, something extremely prevalent throughout human history. Some of the remains of the meal were left around Brian's cairn, and then it looks like they also threw earth around the side of the cairn, whilst the fire was still burning. We know this because studies of the soil showed that it was stained red. The only possible way this staining can occur is when the earth is thrown directly onto the top of an open flame. From this and many other clues, this is the scenario that Ralph Selecki came up with. However, the story of Brian doesn't end there. After the bones had later been taken back to the lab for further study, it was discovered that Brian was not your typical Neanderthal. He was extremely disabled. He had a withered right shoulder blade and upper arm, and his lower arm and hand were completely missing. So now, when we picture the life of Brian, we must picture an individual who would not have been able to contribute much to the daily Neanderthal lifestyle, the rough struggle of survival. He was probably unable to look after himself, yet he had lived to the Neanderthal equivalent of the ripe old age of 40. We must therefore conclude that Brian had help. He had been looked after by others. So we are dealing here with people capable of compassion. This is not a competitive, instinctive animal. These are people who look out for each other and who perform ceremonies of remembrance when they lose a loved one. During a later excavation at Shannon, they found another burial that they called Shannon 4, another male skeleton, so I'm going to call him Graham. Now Graham was buried in that flexed position I mentioned earlier, on his left side with his arms folded and his knees drawn up against his chest. He had been placed into a little area of rocks in one corner of the cave. Ralph and the team proceeded to lift out the skeleton and then take samples of the soil in order to have a record of what the cave was made of. For example, a load of mice decided that this was the perfect cave to practice their burrowing skills. The team needed to be able to tell the difference between the modern and the ancient burrowing. Now, for some reason, probably involving the words funding and paperwork, it wasn't until 8 years after the excavation that the soil was finally analysed. The analyst was a Parisian woman. Everyone in this video seems to be French. A Parisian woman by the name of, Ellen Ardet Lecoir Gourchant. I'm sure I've completely mispronounced that name. Now, this Graham story is incredible. She discovered every sample in relation to Graham was practically stained yellow from huge quantities of pollen. Those amounts were so great that it would not have simply just blown into the cave. There were different types of pollen that belonged to a huge array of different plant species. 7 different early summer flowering plants were discovered in the soil samples, along with evidence of pine branches. The pollen was clumped together in such a way that there was strong evidence that all these flowers had been placed down in the soil of the burial in bunches that had then been woven into the pine branches. So, these Neanderthals were people who buried their dead not just with honour, but also with flowers. Sound familiar? Just like us. It shows huge creative potential in forming these bouquets, and possibly more importantly, it is dripping with symbolism. Flowers are symbolic of resurrection. The flower must die for the seed to be recreated and spring anew. Symbols too of a human sense of the beautiful and of caring for a loved one as if they were still alive. Something again that we still do in many of our own modern burial services. A preparation for the next world. In conclusion, while we may never know what Neanderthals believed in, it is, thanks to recent developments, quite clear that when it came to death, they believed in something. What we can say is that they had ritual and ceremony when they lost a friend or a family member. They believed that there was something more to the world than what we physically observe in it, and that for a Neanderthal, death was not the end of the incredible human journey. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. I really am loving making these videos. I hope you enjoyed this, or at least found it a little bit interesting. If this is your kind of thing, please hit the subscribe button, as I'm just at the beginning of this incredible human journey series, and there are going to be a lot more of these kind of topics. As I work my way through the past, we're going to have lots more of these unusual topics through history. So thanks again, and I'll see you soon.